Jesus Trilogy, Book 1, The Four Messiahs, Chapter 36. It took Mary and Joseph 4 days of pushing to get to the banks of the Red Sea. Mary's uncle Clampett had lived in Egypt for many years. The only thing Mary remembered of him was the story he used to tell of the parting of the Red Sea. It was a story of so long ago, of ancient times, ancient peoples, but it was also a story of her ancestors. She could remember his storytelling as if it were yesterday, yet she guessed she was only 6 years old when she first heard about the thrilling adventure. She had made him tell of it over and over again, and now she retold it to herself several times as she rode on Chester. Her soreness was easing and her bleeding was slowing down, but her breasts were swollen and uncomfortable from the bouncing of a week of travel. She was always thankful when they stopped so she could feed her son. It satisfied him and brought not only relief, but a closeness for her. As Mary's pain subsided, her desires rose. Every time she looked at her husband, she wanted him. How could he be so patient with her? He had needs, manly needs. She knew he wanted her from that very first kiss. Their eyes never lied. "Do you know where I can find Mr. Clampett?" Joseph asked the city guard. They had arrived at the open gate, the entrance to the town. It was a pleasant and bright morning, and no doubt would warm considerably by the afternoon. Calais was a beautiful walled city on the shores of the Red Sea, a seaport serving the Red Sea in eastern Egypt. There were massive brick walls on three sides, and the sea made the fourth or west wall. The seaport, with its docks and warehouses, occupied the north end. The main town occupied the center, and the residents primarily lived on the south end, adjacent to a beautiful white sand beach, which stretched for more than 7 miles. It extended from the northernmost seawall to the far southern wall abutting the ocean. It was really the Red Sea, but locals called it the ocean. "Yeah, I know him. Everybody does. Old Clampett lives about 1.5 miles south, last house along the ocean." "Thank you," Joseph said. "You have business with Clampett?" "No, just a long-lost relative come to visit." "Great old guy, that Clampett. Done a lot for this town." "Thanks again." Joseph passed through the gate and headed toward the town center. He then swung south along the beach road. This was actually a boardwalk divided by the lush beach from the town, and it was breathtakingly beautiful. The sun, the water, a lovely family, a new son. God was so good, but what would become of them all? He must keep his faith strong. God truly was watching over them. The events of the last few days proved that fact beyond the shadow of a doubt. The sea was glistening in the morning sun. "Isn't it a beautiful place, Joseph?" "Sure is, baby," Joseph said. Joseph had called his first wife honey and darling, but never baby. He wasn't sure why. He hadn't even made love to Mary yet. Well, he most certainly had love making on his mind. After all, they'd been married 6 months. How had he been able to control himself? No matter, that would all come. "This must be it, Mary," Joseph said. "The guard said it was the last house on the ocean." They were at the last house, but the desert sand stretched another half-mile. Before it met the wall of the city. "Look at that!" he exclaimed. They had both seen it simultaneously. "I wonder who lives down there." Nearly a half-mile down they could make out a huge mansion, white with blue tile covering the roof, the kind only seen in Greece. Joseph had seen pictures in some of the carpentry flyers. The villa was nestled among a dozen or so palm trees. As they came closer, they saw it was surrounded by a low wall with a gate opening toward the sea. The gate was ajar, and on the post they read the name Clampett and Yvonne. Joseph tied up Chester and helped Mary and the baby down. Jesus let out a little cry, upset at the interruption of his lunch. He walked up to the house and knocked on the front door. Joseph had never seen such a beautiful door. He ran his hand over the smooth finish. "I wonder who did this work," he mused. There was no answer at the door. He tried again with the same result. He turned the knob and the door clicked open. "Anybody home?" Again silence. The foyer was beautiful, with a blue tile floor that matched the roof and the high ceiling with crystal chandelier. A white curving staircase led to the next level. Joseph could see through a large double door into the back of the house. He walked through and entered a large open area. "Anybody home?" he repeated. "Hello," Mary called. They then saw him sitting in a large chair. He was reclining against the wicker back, eyes shut, a glass of iced tea in his hand. Only the very rich had ice. Uncle Clampett? Mary recognized him immediately. He didn't tell me he was so. I didn't know, she whispered. The old gent with the gray beard and the tan, rather large body opened his eyes and rubbed them. He looked up, squinting in the blinding sun. Who is it? It's Mary, your niece, with your new nephew and my husband Joseph. Who? I don't know any Mary. He reached for his smoked glass monocle and looked a second time. He now recognized her immediately. As he got up, he winced and held his left side. Then he recovered and gave her a big hug. Mary, how are you? Look at you. You look wonderful. How pretty you've become. He couldn't help noticing the afterglow of pregnancy. He held her at arm's length. Welcome to Calais. Uncle Clampett, this is my husband Joseph and our new baby Jesus. Clampett shook the outstretched hand of Joseph, then took the baby, holding him gently. What a fine young man, such a strong father. How old is the little one? 1 week tomorrow, Mary said proudly. Well, we'll have to ring in the new year right this year. Mary and Joseph hadn't even realized it was New Year's Eve. They had thought of little else but the safety of their precious child. We came to help you celebrate the new year, Uncle. I'm so glad you did, so glad you did. The old man's eyes welled with tears. Sit down, I can't get you a drink. He sat in the shade of the twin palms adjacent to the open-air deck. Joseph set Jesus down in the cradle and began to sing in his deep, soft voice. Lullaby and good night. We got some tea with ice and some fruit. Thanks. Joseph was starved. He bit into a big peach. Mary took an apple and also began to eat. She, too, was ravenously hungry. Anything for the little one? Clampett asked. Then, realizing it was a dumb question, said, Looks like he gets plenty. He sat and sipped tea while the other two ate. Sorry about earlier. I lost Yvonne just a year ago. Doctor said it was her heart, but I know it was cancer. She had terrible pains for years. Tears came again. Mary leaned over and squeezed his shoulder. So good to see you. We got a lot of catching up to do. And we shall do it, Mary said. Where can we put our things? Oh, forgive me. Louis? Immediately from the kitchen door, a tall man appeared dressed in a white uniform. Louis, these are our guests. They'll be staying in the blue room. Please unload their things and tend to the animal. Mary and her uncle spent the afternoon reminiscing while Joseph and Jesus took little naps. Clampett had done well for himself, as Mary found out. He had bought up some land south of town with a little money he had saved from his days as a woodworker. He had been a slave of the Pharaohs. His immediate ancestors had been those who stayed behind when the children of Israel fled Egypt, escaping through the parted waters of the Red Sea. Uncle Clampett's favorite story. About 30 years before the present time, an old pharaoh had died, and the new pharaoh, his son, was much more liberal. His idea was that freedom under his government would promote prosperity, and so it had. Clampett had the best house in town, and one day, as he was walking along his property next to the old wall, he noticed a black substance pooling on the ground. It was oil, that is, black gold. Clampett hit it big. He sold the oil not just locally, but on the international market. He became the town philanthropist. Everybody loved him. At the time, the Romans ruled Egypt, at least in name, but they couldn't tolerate the desert heat, so they confined themselves primarily to the big cities, Cairo and Alexandria. Calais didn't even have a Roman garrison. Rome did provide money to refurbish the city wall, and the Clampett villa was at the end of the city limits. It was a perfect place. He had a good life, but he was terribly lonesome without Yvonne. He still worked with wood, but he was nearly 60. He didn't have the energy he once did. But he did do a lot of community service work. He designed and built a beautiful pulpit for the church. He and Joseph got into a controversial conversation about the woodworking and design. Too deep for the exhausted Mary, she finally nodded off for an hour. Supper was sumptuous, a sumptuous feast fit for a king. There was a huge Greek salad with feta cheese, large silver bowls of Roman pasta, and a spicy meat and bean soup called chili. Clampett said it was from an old Spanish recipe. Huge loaves of fresh hot sourdough bread added to the wonderful aroma. The main course was tender, melt-in-your-mouth lamb chops with mint sauce, of which Joseph must have eaten a dozen. Dessert was a flambé of peaches. The three talked for an hour after supper and then went out on the deck to watch the sunset in the western sky. It was magnificent. A few lazy clouds lay on the horizon in the colors that were the most beautiful that Mary had ever seen. The reds were especially brilliant. Clampett said it was like this every night, but tonight he had ordered an especially beautiful sunset for his guests. Clampett said the redder the sunset, the more love that would be exchanged that night. The newlyweds just smiled. The last rays of twilight had finally disappeared. Joseph held Mary in his arms on one of the large chairs. Waves slightly caressed the sandy shore barely 50 yards away. Clampett was snoring in his chair on the other side of the deck. Mary and Joseph snuggled in the chair for another hour. Finally the houseman came and woke Clampett. Clampett started and then eased out of his chair. "I'm off to bed. Have a good time, you lovebirds." And he padded out of the room. Mary fed Jesus, took him to the blue room, and asked the houseman to watch over him. She then went out to where Joseph was reclining. He was staring straight up at the stars. "Where did all those angels come from, Mary?" "Orion." He was surprised at her answer. "How do you know?" "Zechariah says Heaven's Gate is through the constellation of Orion," she said. "Really?" The moon was full. Joseph thought it be unusually bright. "Maybe let's go for a walk on the beach." "I'd love to," she said, taking his huge hand in hers. They walked together hand in hand down to the shore in the full moonlight. They saw fires flickering as they walked south toward town. It was New Year's Eve, and as the New Year's approached, the celebration was building for the frivolity that would come. The moon shimmered on the water as the two stopped to enjoy the scene. Joseph turned his back to the water and looked into Mary's beautiful brown eyes, eyes more beautiful than any he had ever seen. Spellbound in each other's presence, they remained there for what seemed like forever. Then Joseph whispered, "I love you." It was barely audible. Mary then repeated the words to Joseph in the same whispery tone. Joseph leaned forward and took both her hands in his and kissed her. The kiss also seemed to last forever. When forever came to an end, they eased out of their clothes. Joseph picked her up in his strong arms and carried her down to the water. He laid her gently on the sand, her feet touching the warm sea water. He then lay down beside her, and they kissed again. Long kisses, salty kisses, passionate kisses. He caressed her breasts and kissed them. The taste of milk was so sweet. She caressed his manhood, now filled with passion and love. He caressed her womanhood, now moist with the dew of love. They continued kissing with a passion neither knew the other had. It further heightened their arousal. Mary lay back, and Joseph rolled toward her. He suddenly realized he would crush her. He was twice her size. He put his strong hands on her sides and picked her up. He rolled onto his back and swung her onto him. They slowly began the passionate motions that would ultimately express their undying love for one another. Their anticipation and excitement built slowly, steadily, and surely. The sounds of their love began to heighten. Neither had ever been this happy, this in love, this perfect. They caressed and kissed every part of each other's bodies. Their eyes met and locked. Their climactic rhythm came simultaneously. Just as waves of water caressed their feet on the shore, waves of perfect pleasure caressed their bodies. At that instant, the loud explosion of a firebomb was heard in the city to ring in the new year. The lovers never even heard it. They had become forever one.